Just 2 degrees. A sum hardly noticeable when it comes to the weather, but a catastrophic number when it comes to the Earth's climate. Over the past decade, the effects of climate change are sounding increasingly apocalyptic. The extinction of entire species, an accelerated rise in sea levels, deadly heat waves, and a melting Arctic. People have gone as far as to say it's the end of days, as more of the Earth is consumed by fires and floods each year. Following a rash of wildfires sparked by record-breaking heat waves, Canada's western seaboard was pummeled by a parade of storms that left large parts of British Columbia submerged. High temperatures on the Kazakh steppe turned a once sprawling grassland into a mass grave for horses. India's capital, New Delhi, in lockdown again due to air pollution this time, not the coronavirus. Locusts, once a destroyer of crops, are now a source of food in Kenya. A mega drought has left sun peaks in the Andes entirely without snow, and nothing remains of Bolivia's Lake Pupo except cracked earth. Preventing these kinds of global catastrophes was front and centre when world leaders gathered at the COP26 climate conference in Glasgow in November. 2 weeks of negotiations produced the Glasgow Climate Pact, the first UN agreement to chart a course for phasing out fossil fuels. But last-minute demands from India saw the agreement watered down, leaving some climate activists to label the conference Cop-Out 26. Sarah Morris has more.
More than 30,000 people from almost 200 countries descended on Glasgow for the conference deemed the last chance saloon. World leaders and business figures rubbed shoulders with lobbyists and Indigenous groups living on the front line of the climate crisis.
Let's do this, let's do this, let's do this.
The summit ran over by a day, but finally 2 weeks of fraught negotiations ended in a deal.
Hearing no objections, it is so decided.
But it was a deal of compromise. A last-minute objection from India resulted in an amendment to the fossil fuels clause, in which the original ambition to phase out all coal was weakened to phase down unabated coal.
I'm disappointed, as I've said, in terms of where we ended up, but nevertheless, we have got a historic agreement over the line.
Historic in the sense it's the first UN climate agreement to feature the words fossil fuels and explicitly plan to reduce coal and inefficient subsidies in the industry. Under the deal, countries have to submit more ambitious emissions reduction targets by next year, 3 years earlier than the Paris Agreement required. They've also agreed on rules to establish a global carbon market and govern carbon trading. And wealthy nations have been asked to double the climate adaptation finance they pay to vulnerable countries.
It is a historic moment, but we shouldn't be rejoicing. It's important that the negotiators here have recognised that coal and other fossil fuels contribute to the climate crisis, but they've only barely just done that. The actual words that they've used create loopholes so large you can drive a coal truck through them.
Even though developing countries have secured more funding, they had been fighting for a separate tranche of compensation for those who lose their homes and livelihoods to global heating. Rich countries blocked it.
Now we need to look at who's responsible for the climate crisis. And we know developed countries, rich industrialized countries are responsible for 92% of excess emissions, which means, 92% of climate damages. So they have to take responsibility.
Climate change has got to go!
Throughout the conference, there was a clear disconnect between climate activists, constantly demanding more ambitious outcomes, and the reality of finding consensus among the nearly 200 countries, which all have vastly different domestic agendas and economies.
For all our disagreements, the world is undeniably heading in the right direction.
The overarching aim of this conference was to limit global heating to 1.5 degrees by the end of the century. This deal leaves that goal hanging in the balance and almost entirely relies on countries supercharging their emissions reduction targets at next year's summit. But it will also be remembered as the moment the world started signalling the end of the coal era is coming. Sarah Morris, TRT World, Glasgow.
Now that we have a blueprint for going forward, what will a post-COP26 world look like? Does the political will exist to turn things around, Or have we already reached the point of no return? For some expert analysis, I'm joined by Deirdre Mackay, a Professor of Sustainable Development at Keele University. Professor, thank you so much for joining us here on Just 2 Degrees. I've heard you interviewed not long after COP26 wrapped up, and you said the biggest issue now is going to be implementation, you said. In the weeks since Glasgow, have you seen anything that gives you confidence that governments are ready to start implementing these pledges?
Well, actually, not enough. There have definitely been some really good moves to hold governments to account made by civil society, but our scientists are absolutely clear that unless our emissions can be reduced by 45% by 2030, we're going to exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius in global heating. And we can't let that target slip out of reach. So we really have to get moving with our implementation.
And when you say we have to get moving, what are you looking for from governments post-COP26?
Well, I'm looking for those governments who didn't change their nationally determined contribution for COP26 to revise those NDCs for next November's meeting of COP. So we're not in a post-COP world, we're in endless COP. We have to go through this process again and again until we whittle down those NDC carbon dioxide targets so that we're actually on target to make that 45% cut.
You mentioned a little bit earlier that civil society was doing a good job holding governments to account. But is there anything stopping countries for just providing lip service when it comes to their pledges? I mean, can anything be done to hold governments to account? Can they be sanctioned? And is that even a good idea?
It depends on how the sanctions are structured. What we really need to do is to phase out the subsidies that are supporting the fossil fuel industry. That means banning coal and bringing those coal bans and phase outs forward. We also need to end the Energy Charter Treaty, which actually gives fossil fuel companies kind of recourse when governments intervene in national markets. And that means that we have to facilitate a really rapid transition from diesel to renewables for lower income countries.
And last question to you, Professor, because we are running out of time. Climate finance has always been a sticking point. At the time when global economies are still recovering and trying to recover from COVID-19, how concrete are these climate finance pledges?
Well, what we saw was that the previous pledges weren't met in toto. There was still 20 billion missing. I think we're going to see more foot dragging here, but these are absolutely key to inclusive sustainability. So we really do need to prioritize them. It means much of the global north, what we would call the developed world, learning to live with less. We need to ratchet down our consumption and invest ourselves in green technology and renewable energy and take the rest of the world along with us.
It's a lot to ask, and let's hope we're not having the same conversations come November next year. Professor Deirdre Mackay, thank you so much for joining us. A massive wake-up call for governments and a code red for humanity. A UN report released in August delivered its starkest warnings yet about the impact of global heating. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is the world's most comprehensive climate study to date, and it concluded that human activity has warmed the climate at a rate that's unprecedented in the past 2,000 years. The report also found that unless immediate, large-scale changes are implemented to reduce emissions, the world will reach or pass the 1.5 degrees Celsius warming threshold within 20 years. If that happens, once in 100-year natural disasters could occur annually. Global temperatures were found to be increasing faster than ever before, And scientists say that will result in extreme heat waves and wildfires that are hotter, more frequent and larger than we've ever seen. The Amazon rainforest, often described as the lungs of the globe, could become a savanna unless drastic action is taken. Last year, Arctic sea ice covered its smallest area than in any time in the past 1,000 years. And sea level rises of up to 2 metres by the end of the century can't be ruled out. That would threaten millions of people living in coastal areas. In a worrying sign of our progress, in 2019, atmospheric CO2 concentrations were higher than at any time in the past 2 million years. Coming up later on Just 2 Degrees, planting the seeds of change. Madrid takes an innovative approach to mitigating the effects of global heating, one tree at a time. And
it's been 5 years since we've had any rain. Look at our crops. There are no leaves growing, not even one.
we'll go to Madagascar, where the World Food Programme says the nation could be experiencing the world's first climate change-induced famine. Despite the fact that the use of coal is the single biggest contributor to global heating, many countries still rely heavily on it to keep the lights on and fuel their economies. Germany, the world's biggest producer of brown coal, has promised to phase out its use to zero over the next 2 decades. But as Sibel Karkush reports from the state of North Rhine-Westphalia, Europe's biggest economy is struggling to make good on that pledge.
Some are blocking railways, others facing off against police or heavy machinery. For more than a year, climate activists have been trying to halt the expansion of the Garzweiler open-cast coal mine in the West German state of North Rhine-Westphalia.
We came here to fight against the capitalist destruction against our climate and to stop immediately the ignite mining in Germany. So the government won't solve the problem. We have to solve it as the people.
This makeshift camp aims to block workers from uprooting more trees and razing people's homes. 20 villages have already been demolished to make space for surface coal extraction, including historic monuments. Kainberg and 5 others are next, but some are resisting.
For over 40 years, they've been telling us that we need to move to make way for the coal. But I don't have a reason to leave. For the energy firms, it's easy to say they have permission from the government. Why should they even look for alternatives then?
Residents and activists say the excavations contradict Germany's goal of cutting emissions as part of the Paris Climate Agreement. The government and utility giant RWE, who operate this pit, argue mining is necessary to guarantee that lights remain on and car factories remain rolling. This is one of the world's largest open-cast lignite pits. Hundreds of millions of tons of coal lie here in Garzweiler and its surroundings. Despite the fact that Germany has already started to phase out the use of coal, this mine is inevitably being expanded as the amount of available renewable energy is insufficient to power Europe's biggest economy. Last year, Germany set the date for its coal exit for 2038. The new government hopes to bring the date forward. But earlier this year, the country's highest court found that Germany had already fallen short of its own targets to reduce emissions. It has until the end of next year to come up with new plans. But that, just like its coal exit, may be too late for these villages on the brink. Sibel Karkush, TRT World, Lützerath, Germany.
Planting season is about to start in southern Madagascar, but the only thing likely to grow there is desperation. 5 years of drought have left more than 1 million people on the brink of famine, and that number is expected to double before the end of the year. The World Food Programme says it has the potential to become the world's first climate change-induced famine. Axel Zamovich brings us the story.
locust and cactus leaves. That's the only food these villagers can get their hands on.
This is what we eat. This is all the people in the village eat. It's been 5 years since we had any rain. Look at our crops. There are no leaves growing, not even one.
Southern Madagascar is in the grip of a growing crisis. The worst drought in 40 years has seen crops and livelihoods shrivel.
People do not have enough food to eat. They do not have enough money to have access to the food, and malnutrition rates are augmenting.
The World Food Programme predicts the situation could soon become the first famine in the world caused by global heating.
These people have not contributed to climate change, but they're paying probably the highest price.
The island is already experiencing extremely hot weather and unexpected sandstorms. And another dry forecast for the upcoming planting season means things are about to get worse. The organization expects the number of people experiencing severe hunger to double by the end of the year to more than 2 million.
Madagascar is not an isolated incident. To me, it's the beginning of what we should expect. And the world needs to look at Madagascar to see what's coming your way in many other countries around the world.
The World Food Programme says it needs $69 million to fund its urgent aid program. But no amount of money can reverse the damage already done. Axel Zaimovic, TRT World.
To talk more about climate-driven migration, I'm joined by Wendell Trio, the Director of Climate Action Network Europe, which is Europe's leading NGO coalition fighting climate change. Wendell, thank you so much for your time. When we talk about migration, our minds generally turn to people fleeing conflict and humanitarian crises. Explain to us, what is climate migration and just how prevalent is it?
Climate migration is actually all of the things that you've mentioned, in the sense that in many cases there is clear evidence that the conflicts that occur and that the natural disasters that people get confronted with are actually linked to climate change. And we see climate change in many different forms. It's droughts, heat waves, floodings, etc. But all of those have an impact, direct impact on people, especially in vulnerable countries where you see that harvests will be severely affected, where you see that there will be scarce resources and conflicts around these scarce resources will increase. So all of those elements that you mentioned are actually induced by climate change and by the impact of climate change, and they lead to stronger patterns of migration from vulnerable countries to richer countries such as the European Union.
Where do we see this happening more commonly, more prevalently? Is it in the developing world? Is it Africa? Where do we see a lot of this climate migration?
Yes, indeed. I mean, from a European perspective, it's mainly in Africa and the Middle East. And we know that drought and heat waves have had an impact on the conflict in Syria, where it's clear that reduced agriculture output has created a strong retention between the cities and the countryside. We, of course, see a lot of climate change-induced migration happening in the Saharan countries, where increased droughts is making it very difficult for people to survive. So a lot of those areas really are the places where people will move from their homes to the EU. There's a similar pattern, of course, in the Americas, where it's people from Central America that would try to move to the United States or to Canada for similar reasons.
Is this just an issue of people leaving their own country, trying to start a better life, for example, in the European Union? Or is it a very domestic issue as well, that people are leaving traditional rural farming areas for more urban parts of their own country?
Yes, of course. I mean, a lot of the migration is actually happening in the countries itself or in neighboring countries. As you know, again, the amounts of refugees from the Syrian conflict in the immediate region is much, much larger than it is in European Union. But those migrations get less attention than the ones that of people that come into the European Union with all of the political elements that are around those migration patterns. So yes, there are clearly similar migration patterns in the region itself, and it's in particular people from the rural areas that will try to find a better life, either in the cities, in neighboring countries, or in the end in the European Union, if that is possible.
What is the best solution then? I mean, I know that's the magic question, isn't it? Apart from tackling climate change in general, what would you like to see governments do to really focus on this climate migration issue?
Well, there are a number of issues. First of all, there's the three main pillars of climate action. One is reducing emissions so that we can actually avoid impacts of climate change to happen. And there, as you know, countries have agreed that they will make an effort to try to keep temperature rise well below 2 degrees and preferably even at 1.5 degrees. That is a real challenge, and that would have incredible positive impacts. But at the same time, we know that climate change is already happening. And so one of the elements that we need there, the second pillar, is adaptation. We need to invest in these countries, in sub-Saharan countries, etc., to ensure that they can avoid the most strong impacts of climate change, that traditional agriculture can be adapted to a warming temperature, etc. And thirdly, we need to invest in what is called loss and damage, which means we need to help people to overcome the challenges that they have at home, provide them with new development opportunities, etc., so that they don't feel the need to migrate, because in the end, migration is not the ideal solution. It's only because people don't see other ways forward that they will start to migrate, but preferably people will want to stay at home, and that's where we need to help them to be able to stay at home.
Absolutely, and it is such a tragic result for people to have to move off their own land to try and find a better life. Wendell Trio, thank you so much for your time. Trees are often called the lungs of the earth for their ability to turn carbon dioxide into pure, clean oxygen. They also act as a kind of air conditioning system, something especially useful in cities made of concrete and steel. In an effort to fight both global heating and pollution, Madrid is building a green wall around the city, an urban forest made up of 500,000 new trees, 75 kilometres long. TRT World's Yemi Velasquez reports from Madrid on how the city is sowing the seeds of its climate change strategy.
In an effort to simultaneously fight climate change and pollution, Madrid is building a green wall around the city. The urban forest will stretch for 75 kilometers and eventually be up of nearly 500,000 new trees. The project will make use of derelict spaces that lie between roads and buildings to help absorb 175,000 tons of carbon dioxide per year. It's part of Madrid's strategy to mitigate climate change and also to adapt itself to the realities of global heating.
We need to step up, especially in the cities of southern Europe. A main challenge is fighting desertification, and we believe that the renaturation of urban spaces is an essential tool to establish defense mechanisms that will make cities more resilient.
Citizens around the globe are demanding not just environmentally sustainable cities, but also urban spaces where they can connect with nature and live a healthier lifestyle. 10 years ago, this was a noisy and polluted ring road with thousands of cars passing daily. Now, the traffic has been channeled through a tunnel going underneath this new park that has become one of Madrid's favorite places to relax and exercise. The temperatures around green canopies like these are up to 4 degrees cooler than in other parts of the city.
It's part of a strategy to fight the rise of temperature happening in the city due to daily life, road traffic, pollution, heating or air conditioning systems.
Cities around the world consume 2/3 of the global energy supply and generate 3/4 of the world's greenhouse emissions. But the city of Madrid hopes its urban forest can become an essential part of the solution in the fight against climate change. Jaime Velázquez, TRT World, Madrid.
Thanks for watching this episode of Just 2 Degrees. We leave you now with some images of a planet in peril. I'm Melinda Nucifora. Thanks for watching.